Protection of property is a well-recognized right around the world. Despite the fact that lands and land distribution systems are varied and complex in specific countries, democratic states have laws that provide various protections, as, for example, compensation for expropriation of privately held lands for a public purpose, such as the building of a road. However, as we have seen, indigenous peoples have historically been deprived of their lands without being consulted and without being compensated. The legal violence of colonialism they have sustained created their invisibility, where the dominant culture's legal system treated them as not there and took their lands. So the recognition of land rights in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is meant to restore the dignity that was taken away from indigenous peoples. Recognition of indigenous peoples' land rights is, in other words, part of the concept of equality. Reaffirming the customary land rights of indigenous peoples is not in conflict with the constitutional principle of control and management of lands and natural resources by the state. In the African context, for example, the recognition would uphold the constitutional principle of equality before the law, given that such rights are generally recognized to other communities or traditional chieftaincies in virtually all African countries. In many countries, both written and customary law applies to lands. What does the Declaration say about land rights? The Declaration recognizes subsistence rights and rights to land, territories, and resources, and recognizes that peoples deprived of their means of subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair redress. The Declaration devotes several preambular paragraphs and articles to the right to lands, territories, and resources, which I will now outline for you. Article 8 refers to the prohibition of forced assimilation and destruction of indigenous cultures and provides that states shall provide effective mechanisms of prevention of and redress for any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories, and resources. Article 10 is about the prohibition of forced removal. Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. Article 25 is about the preservation of the spiritual relationship of indigenous peoples to the land. Article 26 is the bold Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Land Right. Paragraph 1, indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Paragraph 2, indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. 3, states shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned. Article 27 is about the recognition of indigenous land tenure systems, namely systems of land ownership and use. Article 28 is about redress for land taken, restitution and compensation. Paragraph 1, indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution, or, when this is not possible, of a just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Article 29 is about the right to conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and resources, and protection from hazardous materials. Article 30 is about the prohibition of military action on indigenous lands. It says that military activity shall not take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the indigenous peoples concerned through their representative institutions. Article 32 is about the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development and use of their lands with the free, prior, and informed consent of their own representative institutions. In conclusion, we see how the Declaration responds to the major violations of indigenous peoples' land rights mentioned earlier in Module 1. The Declaration guides our societies towards peaceful solutions. It starts from recognizing the rights to lands, territories, and resources. It gives us the methodology of dealing with conflicts. Indigenous peoples must be consulted. They have to be represented by their own representative authorities. Requirements for free, prior, and informed consent must be respected. Redress must be provided. Indigenous systems of ownership and use of land must be recognized and respected. There cannot be any forced relocation of indigenous peoples. These are steps that will help decolonize much of our world.